The man behind the darkness. Enter Blackwood Asylum, where fractured minds collide with a relentless, supernatural presence. Psychiatrist Daniel Reynolds confronts the darkest recesses of the human soul in a harrowing battle to reclaim sanity and save the trapped spirits within. In this chilling, psychological thriller. Chapter 1. The Whispers of Blackwood Asylum. The air in the reception area of Blackwood Asylum hung thick and heavy, a cloying blend of antiseptic and something far more insidious. The indefinable scent of old dust, despair, and perhaps the lingering echoes of fractured minds. Dr. Daniel Reynolds, a sharp and ambitious young psychiatrist, stood in the dimly lit space, rain streaking down the tall, narrow windows, blurring the already obscured view of the outside world. The asylum itself was a sprawling, Gothic structure, its dark, ancient stone walls seemingly absorbing the meager light, nestled deep within a dense, primeval forest that pressed in on all sides, isolating it from the world beyond. Ms. Jenkins, the asylum administrator, a woman in her 50s, prim and efficient, with a perpetually strained smile that never quite reached her eyes, welcomed him. A challenging posting, perhaps, but a rewarding one, she intoned, her voice flat. Our patients, they require a unique approach. Daniel, eager and confident, met her gaze with a hopeful glint in his eye. I'm ready for a challenge, Miss Jenkins. I believe every mind holds a path to recovery. Miss Jenkins's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle warning Daniel, in his youthful zeal, failed to fully grasp. She led him down a long, echoing corridor, where the unsettling sounds of the asylum began to filter through the oppressive silence. A distant, mournful hum, a sudden, sharp burst of laughter that ended abruptly, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls. He entered a common room, where several patients were scattered about, each engaged in their own strange, repetitive rituals. An old woman rocked rhythmically, her lips moving in silent communion with unseen forces. A young man stared intently at a blank, unadorned wall, his gaze fixed on something only he could perceive. A middle-aged woman meticulously folded and unfolded a single piece of paper, her movements precise and endless. Daniel, ever the diligent professional, approached the young man first. Hello, I'm Dr. Reynolds. I'll be your new psychiatrist. The young man slowly turned, his eyes wide, unfocused, yet holding a chilling intensity. He watches. Always. The man behind the darkness, he murmured, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Daniel's brow furrowed, a prickle of unease beginning to form. He moved to the old woman, attempting a more gentle approach. How are you feeling today? Her eyes darted to the shadows in the corner, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He comes when the lights go out. The man behind the darkness. He sings. Daniel exchanged a glance with a passing nurse, who offered only a weary, knowing look. Finally, he approached the middle-aged woman. What are you doing with the paper? Without looking up, her voice flat and devoid of inflection, she replied, I'm folding a cage to keep him out. The man behind the darkness. He wants to get in. Daniel felt a distinct prickle of unease. 3 patients, all mentioning the same terrifying figure, using the same chilling phrase. He attributed it to shared delusion, a common symptom in isolated psychiatric environments. Yet, the sheer consistency, the palpable, unshakable fear in their eyes, the way their voices dropped to a whisper when they spoke of him, it was unsettling, far more so than any shared delusion he had encountered. Even as he made a note in his pad, the asylum itself felt less like a hospital and more like a vast, echoing chamber for a single terrifying whisper, hinting at a presence far more sinister than any mental illness. Chapter 2: Cracks in the Mind's Wall. Days at Blackwood Asylum blurred into a relentless, suffocating cycle of patient evaluations and file reviews, each one deepening Daniel's unease. He spent his evenings hunched over his desk in his office, the only light a solitary lamp cutting through the pervasive gloom. Meticulously cross-referencing brittle, yellowed patient records that dated back decades, he was searching for patterns, for any historical mention, any subtle clue that could explain the chilling consistency of the man behind the darkness. And he found it, not explicitly, not a clear diagnosis, but in recurring phrases, in unsettling, crude drawings of shadowy figures, and in similar behavioral shifts documented across patient files from the 1950s, 70s, even early 2000s. Patients from different eras, with different diagnoses, had all described the Shadow Man, the one who waits in the dark, the Whisperer. The descriptions were chillingly consistent. A tall, indistinct figure, seen only in peripheral vision or lurking in the deepest shadows, always accompanied by a profound, soul-deep sense of dread that transcended mere fear. Daniel clung desperately to his professional training, to the comforting rigidity of logic and psychiatric theory. This, he rationalized, was a psychological archetype, a manifestation of collective anxiety, perhaps a mass hysteria exacerbated by the asylum's profound isolation, its Gothic architecture, its very history. He had seen similar patterns before, though never with such terrifying consistency or such palpable fear. He observed his current patients, and their fear was escalating, becoming more extreme with each passing day. The young man now scratched frantically at the walls of his room, his fingers raw, desperate to dig him out. The old woman refused to sleep, her eyes wide with terror. Convinced, he sings when I close my eyes, her frail body trembles. The middle-aged woman's paper cages, once neatly folded, now covered every surface of her room. An intricate, desperate attempt to ward off an unseen intruder. Daniel felt a growing responsibility, a desperate need to understand what they were truly experiencing, to find a way to break through their shared terror. But the asylum's oppressive atmosphere was beginning to seep into him, a cold, insidious dampness that chilled him to the bone. He found himself working later and later, often the last one left in his office, the only light in a vast, echoing darkness. The silence of the building at night was profound, yet somehow loud, filled with an unseen presence. One night, as he reviewed a particularly disturbing patient drawing of a shadowy figure with elongated limbs, he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, just at the very edge of his hearing. It sounded like his name, Daniel. He froze, his pen clattering to the desk, the sound shockingly loud in the stillness. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nothing. Just the empty office, the shadows deepening in the corners. He shook his head, rubbing his temples, dismissing it as fatigue, the stress of a new, challenging posting. Later, walking down a dimly lit corridor towards his quarters, he saw it again. A fleeting shadow, too tall, too thin, darting into a doorway just as he turned his head. A momentary distortion in his peripheral vision. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, attributing it to a trick of the light, a visual distortion caused by exhaustion. But the image lingered, a persistent prickle of unease on his skin. The cracks in his carefully constructed reality were beginning to show, and the whispers of the man behind the darkness were no longer confined to his patients' minds. They were reaching for his own. Chapter 3. The Invasive Presence. The subtle disturbances had intensified, becoming undeniably intrusive. A relentless assault on Daniel's carefully constructed reality. His office, once his sanctuary of logic and reason, now felt less like a place of professional solace and more like a psychological battleground. The whispers, once faint and easily dismissed as fatigue or the tricks of an old building, were no longer imperceptible. They were distinct, chillingly clear, echoing inside his head with a resonant quality that bypassed his ears entirely and vibrated directly in his skull. They spoke his name, a sibilant hiss that coiled around his thoughts, then began to taunt him, twisting his innermost fears, planting insidious seeds of doubt and paranoia. You're next, Daniel. He sees you. He knows your fears. The insidious nature of the voices was their ability to mimic his own inner monologue, making it almost impossible to discern where his thoughts ended and their malevolent influence. He tried to block them out, to anchor himself to the familiar routines of his work, to focus on patient files and diagnostic criteria. But the voices were relentless, a constant, insidious presence. They began to hint at sinister secrets about the asylum itself, about its dark, hidden history, about the very nature of the man. They brought him here. They made him. He feeds. Daniel clutched his head, his knuckles white against his temples, his mind a whirlwind of self-doubt. Was he succumbing to the oppressive environment? Was the ice driven by a desperate need for empirical proof, for anything that could prove he wasn't losing his mind? Daniel installed a small, hidden camera in his office, its tiny lens a silent witness to his torment. He hoped to capture a fleeting shadow, a visible distortion, anything that could validate his terrifying experiences. The footage, however, revealed nothing but an empty room, the mundane reality of his office, bathed in the dim lamplight. Yet when he reviewed the playback, his blood ran cold. He distinctly heard the whispers on the recording, faint but undeniable, a chilling confirmation that the voices were real, even if unseen, even if they left no visual trace. This was not a trick of his mind. This was an external, pervasive force. His patient's behavior, mirroring his own escalating torment, grew more extreme, more disturbing. The young man, once merely staring at a blank wall, had started holding long, one-sided conversations with it. His voice hushed and deferential, as if speaking to an invisible master. The old woman screamed uncontrollably at night, her frail body racked with terror, claiming, "He's touching me," her pleas echoing through the silent corridors. The middle-aged woman, Her paper cages, now covering every surface of her room, had begun to draw intricate, terrifying maps on them. Maps of a labyrinthine darkness, of unseen pathways and hidden chambers. Daniel felt a profound responsibility to them, a desperate need to understand what they were truly experiencing. He realized, with a dawning horror, that if he was hearing the voices, if he was seeing the shadows, then their delusions might be something far more terrifying. A shared perception of a very real, very evil presence that preyed on the minds within Blackwood Asylum. The boundary between real and virtual, between sanity and madness, was dissolving with terrifying speed, and Daniel was trapped on the blurring line, facing an enemy that lived not in the physical world, but in the very depths of the human mind. Chapter 4: Unearthing the Truth. Driven by the escalating psychological torment and a desperate, gnawing need for answers, Daniel could no longer cling to the comfort of psychiatric rationalization. The whispers in his head were a constant, insidious presence, twisting his thoughts, blurring the lines of his sanity. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he had to find the source, to sever the connection, not just for himself, but for his patients, whose suffering now felt inextricably linked to his own. He dismissed Ms. Jenkins's polite but firm resistance, her veiled warnings about restricted areas and patient safety. He knew the real danger wasn't in the patients' minds, but in the asylum's hidden past. Under the cover of night, or during shifts when he knew he wouldn't be disturbed, Daniel began his forbidden investigation. Sneaking into the dusty, abandoned wings of Blackwood, places untouched for decades, where the air hung thick with decay, the silence profound, yet somehow charged with a palpable, unseen energy. His search led him to a disused administrative office, its furniture draped in white sheets like forgotten ghosts. Here, amidst crumbling ledgers and forgotten stationery, he found them. Old, brittle staff logs, their pages yellowed with age, detailing a dark, horrifying past. The entries spoke of unethical experiments conducted on patients in the 1930s and 40s. Chilling attempts to cure mental illness through extreme sensory deprivation, brutal electroshock therapy, and experimental drug trials that bordered on torture. He uncovered chilling accounts of patients driven not to recovery, but to catatonia, to profound, irreversible states of terror and mental fragmentation. One name recurred with unsettling frequency in the most disturbing entries, a name that seemed to hum with a dark energy: Dr. Elias Thorne. The logs described him as a brilliant but ruthless psychiatrist, obsessed with the nature of consciousness and unlocking the mind's hidden potential. A man who saw human minds not as subjects to heal, but as raw material for his perverse experiments. Following cryptic notes and faded floor plans he found tucked away in Thorne's personal effects, Daniel discovered a hidden room, a small, soundproof chamber deep within the abandoned wing, not on any official blueprints. The air inside was stagnant, heavy, imbued with a palpable sense of dread. The walls were covered in crude, frantic drawings, spirals, eyes, and shadowy, elongated figures, eerily similar to those he'd seen in his current path. He uncovered chilling accounts of patients driven not to recovery, but to catatonia, to profound, irreversible states of terror and mental fragmentation. One name recurred with unsettling frequency in the most disturbing entries, a name that seemed to hum with a dark energy. Dr. Elias Thorne. The logs described him as a brilliant but ruthless psychiatrist, obsessed with the nature of consciousness and unlocking the mind's hidden potential. A man who saw human minds not as subjects to heal, but as raw material for his perverse experiments. Following cryptic notes and faded floor plans he found tucked away in Thorne's personal effects, Daniel discovered a hidden room, a small soundproof chamber deep within the abandoned wing, not on any official blueprints. The air inside was stagnant, heavy, imbued with a palpable sense of dread. The walls were covered in crude, frantic drawings, spirals, eyes, and shadowy, elongated figures, eerily similar to those he'd seen in his current patient's files. And in the very center of the room, standing like a macabre throne, was a rusted, archaic device, a chair with leather restraints, a metal helmet adorned with electrodes, and a control panel for extreme sensory deprivation. This was Thorne's inner sanctum, the crucible of his horrific work. As Daniel examined the drawings, a cacophony of tormented screams and fragmented thoughts erupted in his head. No longer just whispers, but a deafening chorus of agony that threatened to overwhelm him. He trapped us. He opened the door. He feeds. The truth, horrifying and undeniable, slammed into Daniel with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. The man behind the darkness wasn't a delusion, not a shared archetype, not a mass hysteria. It was a psychic entity, a malevolent consciousness born from the collective suffering and fractured minds of Thorne's victims, a monstrous byproduct created by the very experiments meant to cure them. It thrived on fear, on mental anguish, on the blurring of reality, a parasitic entity feeding on the very essence of human sanity. He realized, with a chilling clarity, that his patients were delusional. They were perceiving something real, something that lived and breathed in the very fabric of Blackwood Asylum, feeding on their minds, growing stronger with each tormented thought. Dr. Thorne hadn't just broken minds. He had inadvertently created a monster, and now that monster was reaching for Daniel, its whispers promising to make him its next meal, to add his mind to its endless chorus of suffering. The boundary between real and virtual had collapsed entirely, and Daniel was standing, terrified, in the heart of a mind's prison, with no escape in sight. Chapter 5. The Mind's Labyrinth. Daniel stood in the hidden chamber, the rusted, archaic device glowing faintly in the oppressive darkness, its presence radiating a malevolent energy that crackled in the air. This was it. This was the heart of the nightmare, the lair of the man behind the darkness. The entity manifested not as a physical form, but as a powerful, shapeless psychological force that assaulted Daniel's mind directly. An unseen predator, tearing at the very fabric of his sanity. The room twisted around him. Walls rippled like disturbed water, and his memories began to distort, flashing past him in a terrifying, kaleidoscopic blur of fear and doubt. He saw his own face contorting into grotesque masks of terror, heard his own voice whispering insidious doubts, saw his past failures magnified into insurmountable mountains, all designed to break him, to shatter his will, to make him surrender. You are weak, Daniel. Just like them. You can't escape. We are all one here. Your mind is ours. The entity's voice was a chorus of whispers, the distant screams of its victims, and chillingly, Daniel's own distorted thoughts, all interwoven into a symphony of psychological torment. Daniel clutched his head, his knuckles white, fighting back against the overwhelming psychic assault. He forced himself to breathe, to anchor himself to reality, to the rough texture of the floor beneath his feet, to the cold metal of the device before him. He realized, with a sudden, desperate clarity, that the entity thrived on fear, on delusion, on the very mental anguish it inflicted. It wanted to consume his sanity, to add him to its endless chorus of tormented souls, to make him another, silent, screaming echo in its labyrinthine prison. He remembered the patients, their desperate pleas, their shared perception of the truth. He couldn't let it win. He had to sever its connection, not just to himself, but to them, to break its hold on every fractured mind within Blackwood Asylum. This was not a physical battle. It was a war for his mind, for his very soul, fought on an unseen battlefield. He closed his eyes, focusing on the core of his being, on his years of training, on his unwavering belief in the human mind's inherent resilience, its capacity to heal, to resist. He pushed back against the invading thoughts, visualizing a shield, a barrier of pure, unyielding will. He tried to project clarity, truth, to expose the entity for what it truly was, a parasitic consciousness born of human suffering, not an omnipotent demon, but a creation, a pathology. He opened his eyes. The room was still distorted, shimmering with malevolent energy, but he now saw a faint, pulsating core within the swirling darkness, the entity's nexus, its connection to the asylum's dark history, to Thorne's archaic device. He knew what he had to do. With a surge of primal strength, he lunged for the rusted device, ignoring the entity's deafening screams of rage, its desperate final attempts to break his focus, to pull him under. He brought his geological hammer down with all his might, a desperate, primal act of destruction, smashing the archaic machinery. A deafening psychic shriek, a sound that tore through the very fabric of the chamber, erupted from the entity. It recoiled, its shadowy form flickering violently, weakening, its hold on reality diminishing. The distortions in the room began to subside, the walls slowly solidifying, the air clearing. The voices in Daniel's head diminished, fading into a distant, mournful hum, a retreating echo of torment. He had not destroyed it entirely, perhaps, for evil, he realized, was never truly eradicated, only contained. But he had severed its primary connection, weakened its hold, broken its power over the minds it had preyed upon. Daniel stumbled out of the hidden chamber, collapsing into the abandoned corridor, gasping for air, his body trembling, his mind reeling from the impossible vision. The asylum still stood, its gothic silhouette against the encroaching dawn, but the oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a profound, if unsettling, quiet. He had escaped, his sanity scarred but intact, forever marked by what he had witnessed. He knew the patients would begin their long, difficult path to recovery, their minds no longer under the entity's direct, malevolent influence. But Daniel was forever changed. He had walked the boundary between real and virtual, faced the malevolence born of human cruelty, and seen the terrifying reality of the mind's prison. He carried the knowledge, the whispers, the chilling understanding of what truly waits in the darkness. He was free, but the asylum's secrets and the shadow of the man behind the darkness would forever haunt the labyrinth of his own mind.